Cinema's relationship with black and white film is a strange one. What nowadays is nearly always a creative decision originally began as a technical limitation, just like shooting 24 frames per second and even sound. The first films ever weren't silent because the filmmakers thought that was a better choice. They were silent because the technology required to record sound had not yet been developed. Similarly, shooting at 24 frames per second wasn't a result of extensive study, but a budget decision informed by the fact that 24 frames per second is simply the lowest amount of frames that the human eye is still capable of perceiving as continuous motion. But one other remnant from this original, technically limited era of film has persisted, and that is the use of black and white. My take is that a lot of black and white films today, especially student films, of which I'm admittedly guilty of, completely miss the point of black and white. It's used to hide a low budget or mediocre story under the pretense of a deeper artistic vision, which in reality just doesn't exist. This is of course not true for every film. Excellent examples of the use of black and white appear in cinemas every year, but there is one film that I think posits the most original and creative use of black and white in recent memory, and that's Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. You have to dig pretty deep to find another film that mixes color and black and white film in a way quite like Oppenheimer does. In fact, the only example that springs to mind is another Christopher Nolan film, Memento, which used the format to distinguish between the two timelines of the film. But Oppenheimer doesn't use black and white to distinguish between time. We even see some of the scenes play out in both black and white and color. Instead, the film uses it to distinguish perspective. During the original breast junket of the film, Nolan kept referring to the two perspectives as subjective and objective, which in hindsight seems like clever misdirection aimed at not giving away important plot elements. Because in the actual film, the two perspectives that the colors represent are clearly that of Oppenheimer and Lewis Strauss, as evidenced by the opening titles. Fission is about breaking apart complete wholes, such as atoms or Oppenheimer's life, and fusion is about merging two elements into a new whole, such as Strauss's concentrated efforts to bring the H-bomb into existence and to bring Oppenheimer down. Tracking the reasoning behind this approach is interesting. When Nolan set out to tell the story of Oppenheimer, he didn't simply set out to tell the story of the making of the bomb, but the man's entire life, including his eventual fall from grace, which occurred years later, largely thanks to Lewis Strauss. And simultaneously, Nolan also wanted to root the film as deeply in Oppenheimer's subjective perspective as possible. The character features in every single colored scene in the film, and even the script itself was written in first person. But how to depict the intricate reasons behind the downfall of Oppenheimer while also keeping the audience firmly connected to his subjective point of view, when for the most part he wasn't even aware of what was actually happening? How to maintain immersion but still tell the rest of the story? And the solution that Nolan arrived at is something that appears more brilliant every time I rewatch the film, lifting the audience out of Oppenheimer's perspective and placing them inside another one, Lewis Strauss. I say this choice is brilliant because it solves two very important problems. The first problem it solves is the one we already discussed. We need the necessary perspective that Strauss gives us on the actual reasons behind Oppenheimer's eventual downfall for the story to make sense. And the second, arguably much larger problem is that in the grand scheme of Oppenheimer's life, Strauss appears almost near the end, decades after Oppenheimer's formative studies in Europe and years after the detonation of the bomb. But if he is to work as an effective villain in the film, he can't just stroll in at the beginning of the third act. Rather, in order to work for the film, Strauss has to be involved from the beginning, just as he is. He's introduced in only the second scene of the film, behind only Oppenheimer himself, not as an accessory to Oppenheimer's story, but rather a hero in his own, different story. This is where the brilliance of shooting Strauss in black and white begins to show. The visual difference that a complete change in perspective demands is not as simple as a cut or a title, but a complete change in the feel of the story. Oppenheimer's story is about big ideas, which isn't just signified through color, but beautiful shots of nature and architecture, and little everyday details in which he sees something that we don't. But Strauss's world is completely void of color. It's cold and lifeless, and takes place entirely in medium shots and tight close-ups inside office rooms with zero regard for the beauty of the outside world. Swap the formats and suddenly it doesn't work, because Nolan doesn't use the format simply to distinguish between the perspectives, but to accentuate them. Nolan loads the colored sequences with life and purpose, and strips the black and white sequences of everything that doesn't immediately concern Strauss and his tiny world. It's a brilliant and unique use of black and white, because it doesn't signal a specific period or nostalgia for a certain era of film, but rather a small mind devoid of any thinking besides black and white, in comparison to a massive one.